Hi everyone, Carl here and I hope you're all doing great. Today I'm going to be wrapping up the half timber ruin I have been working on for the last few videos. When we left this project last week, I had just finished priming it. My objective for today was to paint it up in a way that looks good and is easily repeatable for when I make a batch of buildings. I started up by painting all the exposed wood in cadmium yellow. A couple of coats were plenty to get good coverage, and I wasn't aiming for a perfectly smooth surface. I just made sure there was plenty of yellow everywhere. I wasn't too careful here since everything else was going to get painted over later, but I should have been a bit more careful with the brick areas, as I think the white and black prime was almost good enough on its own. When the yellow was completely dry, I washed it all with a raw amber wash. This did not look good on its own, so I did a second wash on top. All the bits in the wall got a second coat of raw amber, and the floor got a wash of Mars brown to add some variety. With the washes fully dry, I painted the tiles ultramarine blue. The reason I painted them at this stage was so that I could dry brush them along with the rest of the wood. I love this color as you can get a bunch of different results depending on whatever you are painting it over. For example, this roof from my pizza box house is painted with exactly the same paint. Highlights aside, the only difference is that in the older model, the blue was painted over white, and in this case, the blue was painted over a stained grey. I went in and aged the wood by dry brushing it with grey. I went a bit heavier on the outside because this would have been exposed longer. With that done, I base coated the plaster bits of the wall in yellow ochre, and wood blended some ivory on top. This is really easy to do, you just have to work fast. The way I did it was to paint a fresh layer into the shaded areas. While this was still wet, I added a layer of ivory a bit further up, and then, using the same brush, I pulled the fresh ochre towards the ivory. This creates a nice, smooth transition between the two. Then I did the same using ivory and white. At this point I wasn't too happy with the result, as it was looking a bit blobby and artificial. To tone it down, I painted a very thin layer of white over it all, being careful to avoid the cracks. The thin layer allows some of the shading to show through, and I'm a lot happier with this. Around this time I also painted the interior wall, though this was just a yellow ochre coat and a quick dry brush with ivory, so I will not be covering that in this video. Next I painted the exposed stonework grey. Once it was all covered, I started dry brushing it with Payne's grey from the bottom up. The direction of the dry brush is important, and I only want this grey to go on the lower facing edges. Next I dry brushed with yellow ochre and ivory from the top down, so they would only catch the upper edges. I was going to apply some washes next, so to protect the paint I had already laid down, I sprayed on a thin coat of varnish. I'm not sure if this is necessary with model paints, but I found that with artist's acrylics, very thin layer like you get when you're dry brushing can get washed off very easily if you get a lot of water on them. But a quick clear coat is enough to keep them safe. The wash I used was black and brown paint with a dash of soap water. I should have added a lot more water in there because this was definitely stronger than I had hoped, and it muted the colors a lot more than I had intended. While the wash was drying, I took a tiny amount of summer green paint on a bit of sponge and wiped off most of it. Then I dabbed it onto the bottom edges and in a few places around the model. To finish off, I applied another ivory dry brush over the stonework. Since the wash was a bit too dark, I went pretty heavy with this. If the wash had been lighter, I would still have done this to bring out the texture, but only very lightly. Once that last layer of dry brush was on, I was happy to call this done. Now, this building is not going to be terribly useful on its own, so I will be making some friends for it, because everyone needs a friend. To make that less painful, I went over the whole project and looked at what worked, what didn't work, and what could be improved. My targets for this system were to have something which allows me to crank out pieces quickly and cheaply. I also wanted to be able to represent the infill and the structure of the ruins, and keep the frame to nice looking proportions. and I think I managed to hit all of those targets. Most of my issues were in the painting rather than the build system itself. For starters, because most of the model is exposed wood, if I had primed it yellow and black instead of white and black, it would have saved me having to base coat all the wooden parts in yellow. It's not a big deal for one building, but if I was making a batch, the time would add up. I really liked how the wood turned out in the end, especially using different washes to give the wood different undertones, so I will be definitely doing that again. The painting of the plaster parts was definitely overdone, and I think a base coat, a wash and maybe some highlights would have been fine. This is like when you have a unit of models, the individual details don't stand out as much and the overall appearance of the group is more than the sum of its parts. Also, I like wet blending, but I don't feel like doing it over and over and over again. For the build, I could have taken a shortcut when working on the roof, as all the rafters on one side should be identical. So once I measured the leading rafter that sits at the front, I could have used it as a template for all the rafters on the same side. Just have to be careful not to mix them up. If I had access to crafting grade foam board, I could work a bit faster because I wouldn't need to cut the stock to the thickness I wanted. On the other hand, because the slices I used were cut by hand, they resulted in a building where the walls are not perfectly square, which looks great on a ruin. Besides, I found cutting the foam surprisingly relaxing, so maybe this is one time saver I can do without. One thing I definitely underestimated is how much the foam compresses. On the edges, the brick gets really thin. This isn't a big problem, but the edges are far too thin for the size of the bricks I drew for the infills. I could either draw smaller bricks or texture to look like wooden boards instead. There's an alternative I thought of, making a double layer wall which would allow me to texture the interior wall as well, but that's something I still need to test out. If it works, it will also save me the drying time on the filler. If I wanted to be nice to myself, I would probably try to make larger sections of exposed brick, because some of the smaller ones are very tricky to paint in dry brush. The last thing is something I already mentioned in the video when I made the floors, which is to measure on the model, rather than assuming I have the exact dimensions of everything. That's about all the points I could think of. What about you? If you have any ideas or suggestions on how to improve the process, I'd love to discuss it in the comments below. In any case, thank you for sticking this video out. I hope you got something useful out of it, and that you will join me for my upcoming videos. I have a crafting challenge with some other YouTubers coming up at the end of October, but I'll probably be making some other stuff in between. I mean, that's kind of what I do. Thank you for watching and have a great day.